In the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, we find Jesus in a state of grief, distress, and agitation, because he knows that his physical torment is near. He knows that in a few hours he will begin to feel unimaginable physical pain until he dies. And that special attention will be given to make that death as painful as possible, for as long as possible, and for it to be as humiliating as possible. So he does what most anyone would do. He gathers with his closest friends and he prays to God for God's intervention. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane along with his disciples so they can pray too. He leaves some at the entrance to the garden and takes the three closest to him, Peter, James, and John. He instructs them to sit, watch, and pray there as he goes deeper in. The instructions to sit, watch, and pray seem simple enough when a friend and mentor is grieving. Yet they couldn't keep their eyes open. When Jesus returns from praying, he finds them asleep, as he has experienced before. All three, Peter, James, and John, were asleep, but Jesus looks at Peter, the one whom he said, "Upon this rock I will build my church," and says, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not keep awake?" Jesus reminds them of the command to stay awake, and then he goes to pray a second time. And when he returns, they are asleep again. He goes to pray a third time, and when he returns, they are asleep yet again. And immediately following, Jesus is arrested, and the journey to the cross begins. When we encounter this passage and other instances of the disciples sleeping, we scratch our heads in bewilderment. How could these disciples who declared Jesus to be the Son of God be so quick to slumber during the time Jesus needed them the most? Presbyterian pastor Mark Davis puts it this way, quote, "Christ faces death while the church sleeps. Christ is distressed and agitated while the church sleeps. Christ is horrified at the awful prospects that God's will is performed through the actions of those who reject God's chosen one while the church sleeps. Even in the critical moment when Christ embraces the will of God by accepting the cup of suffering, the church sleeps." Davis concludes that the depth of human sin might not be expressed in vile acts of utter evil as much as in the act of sleeping, when the fate of the world hangs in the balance just a stone's throw away. The fate of the world hangs in the balance right now. And the world needs the church to awaken from its slumber, to fulfill the call to bring the good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go away free. Yet, more and more, it feels like the church in America has done the opposite. Instead of being the place of refuge for the oppressed, it has become a safe haven for oppressors. While the church has been asleep to the cries of the oppressed, the poor, the disenfranchised, and those rejected by the powerful, it has been awake enough to cash the checks of those who have profited off the very people Jesus has told us to take care of. The church has been more interested in bucks, buildings, and butts in seats than liberating the oppressed. And preachers who have the people who need to be convicted in their hearts sitting in their pews week after week preach sermons geared towards more of a laugh rather than changing hearts and minds. We have fallen victim to the sleeping sickness. We've fallen asleep while corporations were counted as people and allowed to spend enormous amounts of money on elections. We have slumbered while Roe v. Wade was overturned. We snoozed while affirmative action became illegal. While schools are barred from talking about race and gender in any meaningful way, guns seem to have more rights than people. Housing is astronomically more expensive and wages are largely unchanged. The minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. The cost of food is astronomically higher. There was an attack on the U.S. Capitol, and the person primarily responsible for it is a leading candidate for president of the United States. Folks, we are living in a time of multiple revolutions right now. This sleepiness is spread from person to person via the internet, cable news, and from certain politicians who are playing the role of Sandman, blowing the dust into the faces of the people that they want to control. These folks are actually trying to legislate the sleeping sickness from state to state. They aren't even bothering to disguise their plan and aims because they are convicted that enough people are already asleep. Because if they were awake, these individuals never would have been elected in the first place. One state's governor, who was the second leading candidate for president for one political party, passed and signed a law that is boldly and proudly called anti-woke laws. That makes it illegal to teach about racial oppression and other so-called sensitive topics in schools that make kids uncomfortable or feel guilty. Some of the results of these laws of that school curriculum now requires that students learn the so-called benefits of enslavement for the enslaved and bar schools from even mentioning that Rosa Parks was a black woman. This same law bars colleges and universities from hiring DEI professionals and requiring diversity and inclusion training. We sleep through a revolution when we declare that things really aren't as bad as we may think. We sleep through a revolution when we refuse to engage with real people and deal exclusively in a virtual world instead, where we only listen to our own virtual echo chambers. We sleep through the revolution when we refuse to listen to the voices of the oppressed and do not advocate for their liberation. We don't realize that advocating for their liberation does not mean that we adopt their beliefs, lifestyles, practices, or realities. We sleep through a revolution when we fall victim to the same thing Rip Van Winkle was conned with, and that Lift Every Voice and Sing warns us of when we have become drunk with the wine of the world and forget thee. Not only are many in the nation asleep during the revolution, but the church